If you want to stop losing at chess and win your next few games, then watch this video. Today I'm going to be breaking down my entire thought process on how I think about the game from the opening to the middle game to the end game. My opponent is at 2000 level bot. E6 was played. Let's just play d4. It's very important that we try to control the center of the board. My opponent is playing the French defense, by the way. Now, we definitely don't want to take on d5 in this position because if we take the pawn, then pawn takes pawn and it helps the opponent's bishop to get in the game. And that's the first thing that we're going to be talking about. To take is a mistake. So in chess, you should only be trading pieces if it improves your position. So instead, I'm going to play the move pawn to e5. This is called the advanced variation of the French. And the whole idea is to keep this bishop bad and ensure that this knight does not get free development. Now, pawn c5 was played. Now I'm just going to play pawn to c3, ensuring that I keep this pawn chain intact. And then after knight to c6, applying more pressure to my pawn chain, I'm just going to play knight to f3, guarding it. So we're still in the opening stage of the game. The idea in the opening stage of the game is to develop the pieces and to develop the pieces as quickly as we possibly can. Bishop to d7 was played. Now I'm going to play the move bishop to d3. Now I have two of my pieces developed. My opponent just took on d4, so I'm just going to take back. And from here, I want to just complete my development. Now, queen to b6 was played. This is a very interesting move because obviously it's very important that we look on the opponent's last move, check to see what the move is doing, and the queen is attacking my pawn on d4. I want to teach you guys about something called tempo or initiative. Basically, what I'm about to do, I'm going to leave my pawn hanging and I'm going to choose to simply castle my king. Because if my opponent decides to take the pawn, which my opponent did, I'm going to show you how to punish this right now. They're basically moving the same pieces over and over in the opening. And my king is out the center of the board while my opponent's king is in the center of the board. Usually when this happens, the goal is to open the center of the board. So let's take this. The queen has to take. And then the other thing that I want you to notice is the queen is attacking my unprotected pawn on e5. Am I going to protect this pawn? No. Why? Because we're going to be playing attacking chess. And once we're playing attacking chess, you have to be prepared to lose material in order to gain what is called the initiative. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to choose to play the move knight c3. Developing my knight. Now, I want you to keep in mind, I have two pieces developed while my opponent is just gobbling up pawns, gobbling up pawns. And what am I going to do? I'm going to use the time to bring pieces in the game with tempo. So basically what that means, and try to guess my moves and my thoughts while I'm going along, but I'm going to play the move rook to e1, bringing more pieces in the game with tempo, attacking the queen. The queen went all the way back to d8. Again, yes, I'm behind by two pawns, but I have what is called initiative. And just like that, we're about to start winning back a lot of material. For example, I want you to notice how my rook is on the same line as the opponent's king. Now, because my rook is on the same line as the opponent's king, you could say this pawn is not actually guarding this pawn. Why? Because pinned pieces does not protect. So, and another thing that I want you guys to keep in mind, especially when you're playing attacking chess, is you want to ensure that you look for those moves that you can play on the opponent's half of the board. For example, knight takes d5 is definitely a candidate move. The pawn is not able to take. Bishop to d6 was played, attacking my pawn on h2. But what did I tell you guys about attacking chess? If you're going to be playing attacking chess, you have to be prepared to lose a pawn or two. So I'm only down by one pawn here. But if I defend this pawn on h2, then I'm going to lose the initiative, and you don't want to lose the initiative. Like, you always want to be the one who is making the attacking move. So instead of just playing a passive move like pawn h3 or pawn g3, I'm going to follow the principle saying offense is the best defense. I'm going to play a development move, queen to g4, leaving h2 unprotected and counter-attacking g7, which is why my opponent decided to move the king out the way. Now the h2 is under attack. Now, I still don't want to protect my h2 pawn. I'm actually thinking of playing bishop to f4. I'm not sure if it works though because the pawn takes, and then if I takes, then this takes, and that looks like it's losing. If the pawn ever take my knight, then I'll take this bishop. So I'm still not necessarily forced to move my knight. So I'm just going to play the move bishop to g5, bringing some pieces on the opponent's half of the board. And I'm trying to get as much pieces in the game. For example, I'd love to get my rook in the game. Now, pawn to f6 was played. If you notice, the opponent is not taking on h2 because I'm just going to move the king and then trap the bishop. But pawn f6 was played. Now, my bishop is under attack. The good thing is the knight is not able to get this square anymore. So that's a good sign. Now, the question is, do we leave the bishop hanging? Now, here's what I'm going to do. Again, we want to play aggressive chess. So I don't mind if they take my bishop if I gain a few attacking moves. So I'm going to leave my bishop hanging. If you notice, the pawn was guarding this pawn. It's no longer guarding the pawn. So I'm going to use my knight to go to f4, attack this pawn on e6. And if the pawn dares to touch my bishop, then I'll take on e6. So the pawn did not take. The knight goes to e7. But I think I'm still fine if I take on e6. If I take on e6, they takes, I takes. Yes, they could take my bishop, but bishop to c4, and that could lead to a checkmate. So let's take on e6 with check. The opponent has to react to it. Bishop takes. Let's play queen takes. And if they take here, well, the opponent is just not taking the pieces that I'm sacrificing. Yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy. Okay, fine. Again, how do we find the best move in chess? We look on moves that we can play on the opponent's half of the board. We look on the checks, we look on the captures, we look on the threats. So, because he's not taking my bishop, I'm going to play the move bishop takes f6, sacrificing the bishop. If, well, he finally accepts one of my sacrifices, but this is where it gets crazy because if I take on f6 and the king goes here, I'm going to play rook c1 and all my pieces are attacking. Now, because the threat is better than the execution, before I even take on f6, I'm going to use the time to get my rook in the game. Now, all my pieces are under attack. This is called an in-between move, by the way. The opponent plays the move knight to f6. No, I'm going to take on f6 with check. And if you look on the opponent's king, he's just a few moves away from getting checkmated or losing his queen. So how are we going to end this? I could start by playing queen to h6 check, but then, he blocks the check. The bishop is hanging. The queen was guarding the bishop. The queen is no longer guarding the bishop. So I'm going to simply play queen takes d6. That's a free bishop. I'm now ahead by 2 points. The opponent's king is forced to move, which he did. And I'm going to show you guys another beautiful move. Now, the first thing I want you guys to notice is the queen and the king is on the same rank, which means a move like rook to e7, that would be a very nice pin. But the knight on c6 prevents us from doing that. I'm going to be teaching you a tactic called removing the guard, where I'm going to sacrifice my rook on c6, and if he dares to touch my rook, rook to e7 simply pins the queen to the king, and from here I'm just completely winning. So rook to f8 was played, and from here we're just going to be trading off the pieces until we win the game. Now, we're not necessarily in any rush to take this queen because it's pinned. So, and there's also this saying in chess that says, whenever you see a good move, you want to look for a better one. So instead of just taking the queen, I'm going to play the move queen to e5 check, which checks the king. The king now has to move, and please pause the video and try to find my next move. But for the person who did not pause the video, I want you to notice how the king and the queen is on the same diagonal, and how I'm going to win this game. And notice how they're on light squares. I'm going to play the move bishop to c4. pinning the queen. And if the queen dares to touch my bishop, then I'm able to play queen g7 checkmate because my rook covers the g7 squares. So let's go bishop to c4. No, I'm just winning the queen. He's not able to take my bishop, so he decided to play pawn to a5. But again, whenever you see a good move, look for a better one. I'm still not going to take the queen. I don't want to I don't want the opponent to get anything in return. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to play the move queen to g5 check, forcing the opponent's king in the corner. And then now that the opponent's king is in the corner, that's when I'm going to take on f7. And just by taking on f7, queen to f6 is just a checkmate. There's nothing the opponent could do. So he decided to play the move rook to g8. But from here, I have checkmate in a few moves. I'm going to take the rook. If the rook takes back, I'm going to play queen to f6 check. If the rook blocks, I'm going to play queen takes g7, and that's a checkmate. So let me show you guys how it looks. Let's take the rook. Once the rook takes back, we go queen f6 check. The rook has to block the check, and that's a checkmate.